true truck driving horror story. Chapter 1: The Open Road. Driving long-haul routes was my bread and butter. I'd been a trucker for over a decade, crisscrossing the United States, moving goods from one coast to the other, and everything in between. I'd driven in snowstorms in the Rockies, through the suffocating heat of the Southwest, and everything in between. So, it takes a lot to rattle me on the road. That night, I was on a straightforward haul from Nevada to Colorado. The trip was long, the kind that required caffeine, loud music, and an occasional slap to the face just to stay awake. I was moving a load of electronics, not the most exciting cargo, but that wasn't the point. The company paid me well, and the road was peaceful, just the way I liked it. I had taken a route that was notoriously lonely, an interstate that cut through stretches of desert where you could go hours without seeing another car or a gas station. I'd driven this route before and always enjoyed the solitude. Out there, it was just me, my truck, and the road. No distractions, no drama, just the hum of the engine and the miles rolling beneath the wheels. But something about that night felt off, even before I left the truck stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forgetting something. I did my pre-trip inspection twice, checked my manifest 3 times, but everything seemed in order. Still, the sense of unease lingered. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I hadn't slept much the night before, so it wasn't surprising that my nerves were a little frayed. I brushed it off, hopped into the cab, and hit the road. But as soon as I was on the highway, that feeling of being watched crept back in. It's hard to describe, like when you walk through a dark alley, and you know someone's watching you, even though you can't see them. The first few hours passed without incident. The radio was cutting in and out, which was normal for this part of the desert. I had my thermos of coffee, some snacks on the passenger seat, and the truck's headlights cutting through the dark. The world outside was pitch black. No streetlights, no signs of life, just an endless stretch of asphalt and the occasional tumbleweed blowing across the road. I was about 4 hours in when things started to get weird. It was a little past midnight, and I was somewhere between the small towns of Ely, Nevada, and Delta, Utah, essentially, the middle of nowhere. The road stretched out in front of me like a black ribbon, and the desert seemed to close in on both sides. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally, I liked the peace, but that night, the silence felt oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on me. And then I saw the first sign. A figure, standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, or a coyote, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man, standing perfectly still, right at the edge of the highway. No car, no hitchhiker's thumb, no movement. Just standing there, staring straight ahead, as if he was waiting for something. I slowed the truck down, squinting into the night to get a better look. He didn't move. Didn't react to the sound of the approaching engine or the rumble of the tires. I got a clear view of him just as I passed by, tall, wearing what looked like a long coat, with his face obscured by shadows. Something about him gave me the chills. It wasn't uncommon to see hitchhikers or people who had broken down on the side of the road, but this guy didn't seem to need help. He wasn't signaling me, didn't try to flag me down. He just stood there, like he was waiting for something or someone else. I glanced in my side mirror as I passed him, but by the time I looked back, he was gone. No trace of him, just the empty road behind me. Chapter 2: The Hitchhiker. After seeing the man on the road, the sense of unease that had been lingering at the edge of my consciousness kicked into high gear. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just some guy hitchhiking in the desert, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, gave me the creeps. I checked the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see him again, but the road behind me was empty. I turned up the radio, hoping the static-filled country tunes would drown out the uneasy feeling in my gut, but it didn't help. About 30 minutes later, just as I was beginning to convince myself it was all in my head, I saw another figure. This time, it was a woman, standing in the exact same spot where I had seen the man. I slowed down again, heart pounding. She was just standing there, like the man had been, right at the edge of the road, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She was facing the truck, her face obscured by shadows. As I got closer, my headlights barely caught her features, but something was wrong. Her clothes looked torn, disheveled, and her skin was pale, almost translucent in the night. I hit the brakes, unsure of what to do. This wasn't normal. I couldn't just leave her standing there, could I? But something in the pit of my stomach told me not to stop. Every instinct was screaming at me to keep going, to get the hell away from her. Then, just like the man, she vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next, she was gone. I didn't see her walk away. She just disappeared, like a wisp of smoke dissolving into the night. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, my heart racing. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I glanced in the mirrors again, but there was nothing. The road stretched out behind me, empty and silent. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I was hallucinating. I hadn't slept well, and it wouldn't have been the first time exhaustion had made me see things that weren't there. But this felt different. More real. More tangible. The night stretched on, and the miles continued to tick by. My unease grew with every passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone was out there, watching me from the shadows. An hour passed. Then another. The road seemed endless, the black desert pressing in from all sides. I was counting down the miles to the next rest stop, eager to get out of the cab and breathe some fresh air, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same man. The same hitchhiker. He was standing in the middle of the road this time, directly in my path. Chapter 3, The Final Encounter. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. The tires squealed on the pavement, and the cab lurched forward as I desperately tried to stop in time. My headlights bathed the figure in light, but this time, there was no mistaking it, he was real. His long coat flapped in the breeze, and his face, pale and gaunt, stared directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The man didn't flinch, didn't react to the 18-wheeler bearing down on him. He just stood there, his hollow eyes fixed on me. For a moment, I considered getting out. Maybe he needed help. Maybe I was overreacting. But something deep inside me screamed not to. The air in the cab felt thick, suffocating, like it was pressing down on me. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, blocking the road, staring at me. Then, as I blinked, he disappeared. I'm not talking about walking away or stepping out of the headlights. He just vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. Panic surged through me, and I jammed the truck into gear. I needed to get out of there, needed to put as many miles as possible between me and whatever the hell that thing was. The tires spun for a second before catching traction, and I peeled out, the truck roaring down the highway. For the next hour, I drove like a madman, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors, waiting for the hitchhiker to reappear. But he didn't. The road stretched on, silent and empty, just as it had been before. But the fear didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, making my pulse race and my hands sweat. I reached the next truck stop just as dawn was breaking. The first light of day was creeping over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. As soon as I stepped out of the cab, the cool morning air hit me, and I realized just how tense I had been. My muscles ached, my head was pounding, and my heart was still racing in my chest. I leaned against the side of the truck, taking deep breaths and trying to calm myself. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or a combination of exhaustion and stress. But no matter how many times I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out there on the highway. Something I couldn't explain. I never took that route again. Chapter 2, Nightmares on the Highway. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into the void, a black ribbon cutting through the heart of the desolate landscape. After my unsettling encounter with the man in the long coat, I drove on, hoping the morning light would banish the shadows creeping into my mind. But the darkness felt thicker now, clinging to me like a second skin, whispering that I was not alone on this lonely stretch of highway. As the hours wore on, fatigue settled in like a heavy fog. I chugged my coffee and blasted the radio, desperate for any distraction. Each song seemed to drift away into static, punctuated by the low rumble of the truck's engine. My eyelids felt like they weighed 100 pounds, and I fought against the urge to close them, knowing that just a moment of sleep could send me crashing off the road. I glanced at the clock. It was nearing 2 a.m. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered that the next rest stop was still a good 50 miles ahead. I cursed under my breath. I should have stopped sooner. Maybe then I wouldn't be wrestling with the lingering images of the man and the woman standing in the darkness. Then, just as I was starting to think that perhaps I was overreacting, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. It was too quick, too fleeting to be anything concrete. Just shadows dancing along the side of the road, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But when I looked again, there was something there, a fleeting glimpse of a figure, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I turned my head quickly, adrenaline surging through me, but nothing. Just the empty stretch of asphalt disappearing into the night. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. But my mind kept wandering back to that brief flash, the uncertainty gnawing at my nerves. Was it real? Or was I succumbing to the stress of the long haul? I turned the radio dial, scanning for anything that could bring me back to reality, but the static hummed louder, enveloping me in its unsettling embrace. I cranked the volume up, letting the distorted notes fill the cab. I needed something, anything, to anchor me. And that's when I saw her again. She was standing at the side of the road, her figure illuminated by my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. My tires screeched against the pavement, and I barely managed to stop before hitting her. The moment I caught sight of her, the air in the cab turned cold, a frigid gust that seemed to seep into my very bones. She wore a tattered dress, her hair hanging in wild strands that obscured her face. I could see her pale skin gleaming under the moonlight, and something deep inside me screamed that I should keep driving, that this was a trap. But I was a truck driver, a part of me felt obligated to help anyone in distress. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the accelerator. She stood there, motionless, her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. I swallowed hard, battling the instinct to flee. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She simply raised her hand, pointing toward the horizon behind me. Confusion flooded my mind. What was she trying to show me? What could possibly be back there? I turned my head to look, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure moving in the distance. It was barely discernible, more like a silhouette against the dark backdrop of the night. Panic gripped me, and I whipped my head back to the woman. But she had vanished. One moment she was there, the next, she was gone, like mist evaporating in the morning sun. I felt the blood drain from my face. The shadows were closing in. My heart pounded wildly as I hit the gas, tearing down the highway, desperate to put as much distance between me and that spot as possible. The engine roared to life beneath me, and I focused on the road, my knuckles white against the wheel. But the figures weren't finished with me. The next hour was a blur of headlights and road signs, my mind racing as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming or if the fatigue had finally caught up with me. As I drove, the headlights illuminated strange shapes along the roadside, distorted silhouettes that seemed to blend into the darkness, flickering in and out of my vision like ghosts. Every time I glanced into the rearview mirror, I expected to see them following me. I could almost feel their eyes boring into the back of my head, watching, waiting. I shook my head, desperate to clear my thoughts. This was just exhaustion. Just a figment of my imagination. But as I pressed on, the oppressive silence outside the truck grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The shadows around me deepened, seeming to stretch and warp, consuming the light from my headlights. It was as if the desert itself had come alive, conspiring against me. I flipped on the high beams, desperate to pierce the darkness, but all it did was create a stark contrast between the illuminated road and the inky blackness that surrounded me. I felt isolated, alone, trapped in a world that no longer felt safe. Then I spotted it again, the same man, the one I had seen earlier, now standing by the side of the road, his coat billowing in the wind. This time, he was closer, and I could see the contours of his face. His eyes were dark, hollow pits, devoid of life, and the moment I caught sight of him, an icy dread enveloped me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling my pulse quicken. I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I glanced back in the rearview mirror, and to my horror, I saw her, the woman, standing right behind the man, her eyes locked on mine, a twisted grin spreading across her face. They were working together, and I was the prey. I punched the accelerator, the truck surging forward, tires screaming as they fought for traction. I could hear the echo of my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't dare look back. I focused on the road ahead, willing the miles to disappear. But the highway seemed to stretch infinitely before me. I was caught in a never-ending loop, trapped in their game. My thoughts spiraled into a frenzy as I wrestled with the fear gripping my mind. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of them, now on the side of the road, now behind me, their figures flickering in and out of the shadows. It was like they were toying with me, playing a game where I was the only one unaware of the rules. Just keep driving, I muttered to myself, trying to fight the rising panic. Just keep driving. I took deep breaths, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't let this get to me. I was a trucker. I was tough. I had faced worse than this. But this felt different. I could feel something dark closing in, a presence that loomed just beyond the edges of my consciousness, whispering that I was not meant to escape. Finally, I reached the next exit, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the madness. The lights of a truck stop flickered in the distance, promising refuge from the terror that had been haunting me on the road. I turned off the highway, my heart racing with a mixture of relief and anxiety. As I pulled into the parking lot, I felt a strange weight lift off my shoulders. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the area, and for the first time in hours, I felt safe. I stepped out of the truck, inhaling the familiar scent of diesel and asphalt, the sounds of distant chatter filling the air. But just as I began to relax, I turned around. And there they were, the man and the woman, standing at the edge of the parking lot, their faces hidden in the shadows. My blood ran cold as I realized I was not free. I was still trapped in their nightmare. As I hurried toward the entrance, my mind raced with thoughts of escape. I didn't want to turn my back on them, but I had no choice. I dashed inside the truck stop, the bell above the door jingling as I pushed through. Inside, the bright lights and bustling atmosphere felt surreal. Truckers filled the booths, sipping coffee and sharing stories, oblivious to the horror I had just faced. I made my way to the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself away from prying eyes. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the lingering dread. I looked in the mirror, but the reflection staring back at me was not my own. It was haunted, eyes wide with fear, a ghost of the man I once was. "Get it together," I whispered, gripping the sink to steady myself. "It's just fatigue. Just a bad night." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could still see the figures lurking just outside the door, waiting for me to step back into the darkness. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm the storm raging within me. When I finally emerged from the restroom, I glanced around, half expecting to see the man and the woman waiting for me. But they were nowhere. Stroy 3. The haunting in the city that never sleeps. Being a truck driver in New York City is an experience all its own. The constant traffic, the impatient drivers, the towering buildings casting long shadows over narrow streets, it's enough to get to anyone after a while. But for me, the city had always been a challenge I embraced. I'd been hauling freight through these streets for years, navigating the chaos like a pro. But after that one night, I'll never look at New York the same way again. It started like any other late-night run. I'd been driving for hours, bringing a load of electronics from Albany into the heart of Manhattan. The job was routine: deliver at a warehouse in Brooklyn, pick up a return load, and head back upstate. The streets were quieter than usual for a Friday night, which should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. The moon hung low over the city, barely visible through the haze of lights and smog. The glow from the skyline felt distant, almost surreal, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I was heading down FDR Drive, the East River to my right, the skyscrapers looming to my left. There was a heavy fog rolling in off the water, thickening the further south I went. By the time I reached the Brooklyn Bridge, it felt like I was driving through a cloud. My GPS had been acting up for the past hour, constantly recalculating, leading me in circles. I knew the city well enough to get by without it, but the thick fog and the maze of detours in Brooklyn made me uneasy. As I passed under the bridge, I noticed something strange, a figure standing on the pedestrian walkway, motionless in the mist. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible through the fog, but as I drove closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned suit. His face was obscured, but his posture was rigid, as if he'd been standing there for hours. I slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield to get a better look, but by the time I passed beneath the bridge, he was gone. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, the fog playing tricks on my tired mind. But the strange encounters didn't stop there. As I entered the quieter streets of Brooklyn, the fog seemed to thicken, muffling the sounds of the city around me. The usual noise, the honking of horns, the distant chatter of late-night pedestrians faded away, leaving only the low hum of my engine and the occasional hiss of steam rising from the manholes. My truck felt like the only thing moving in a city that had suddenly fallen silent. I was about 10 minutes from the warehouse when I saw it again, another figure, standing still in the middle of the road. This time, it was a woman. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown, the kind you'd see in an old black and white movie. Her head was bowed, her hair falling over her face in long, dark strands. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a stop just feet from her. "Hey!" I called out, leaning out the window. "You okay?" She didn't move. She didn't react at all. A chill crawled up my spine. The fog seemed to press in on me, wrapping around the truck like a cold, damp blanket. I honked the horn, but the woman still didn't move. I could feel my pulse quicken, a growing sense of dread creeping into my chest. Something wasn't right. I threw the truck into reverse, slowly backing away from the woman. As I did, she lifted her head, just slightly. Her face was pale, too pale, and her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, locked onto mine through the fog. I felt my blood run cold. She smiled then, a slow, twisted grin that sent a jolt of fear straight through me. I hit the gas, speeding away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if she was still standing there, or worse, if she was following me. By the time I reached the warehouse, I was shaking. I parked the truck in the loading dock, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was just a trick of the fog. Maybe I was overtired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I told myself that, I couldn't shake the image of her eyes, those dark, empty pits staring back at me through the fog. I handed off the delivery paperwork to the warehouse manager, barely able to focus on the conversation. The loading dock was eerily quiet, the workers going about their business in silence, as if the fog outside had seeped into the building itself. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, but something was keeping me from leaving. A nagging feeling, like unfinished business. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, movement in the shadows near the back of the warehouse. My breath hitched. It was just a flicker, barely noticeable, but enough to make my skin crawl. I took a step toward the shadows, squinting into the dimly lit corner. And that's when I saw him again, the same man I'd seen on the Brooklyn Bridge. He was standing there, in the shadows, his figure barely visible but unmistakable. He was watching me, his head slightly tilted, as if curious. My heart pounded in my chest. This couldn't be real. There was no way he could have followed me here. I blinked, and he was gone. I didn't waste another second. I hurried back to my truck, throwing the door open and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The fog outside had thickened again, swirling around the truck, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I pulled out of the loading dock, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove through the fog-choked streets of Brooklyn, the city felt different, darker, more sinister. The buildings loomed overhead like ancient sentinels, their windows black and empty. The usual life of the city seemed to have vanished, leaving only the ghosts and the fog. I was about halfway back to the highway when I saw her again, the woman in the gown. She was standing on the side of the road this time, her hollow eyes watching me as I passed. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, my heart racing, trying to ignore the cold sweat running down my back. But she wasn't done with me yet. A few blocks later, she was there again, standing in the middle of the street, her twisted smile barely visible through the fog. I swerved to avoid her, my tires screeching as I nearly lost control of the truck. When I looked back, she was gone. I kept driving, faster now, desperate to escape the fog, the city, the ghosts that seemed to be haunting me. But no matter how far I went, they were always there, just out of sight, waiting. By the time I reached the highway, I was shaking. The fog was starting to lift, and the distant lights of Manhattan shimmered in the rearview mirror. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the city, that those hollow eyes were still watching me, somewhere just beyond the reach of my headlights. I didn't stop until I was well out of New York, the city lights fading in the distance. But even then, as I pulled into a rest stop hours later, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the man and the woman, standing in the fog, waiting for me. Subscribe my YouTube channel for more new scary horror interesting video. Thank you.